So last time we talked, or I talked, well, we were discussing memes, specifically some of the background, some of the history, and some of the rhetorical functionality. Um, the thing that I think is fascinating about memes, especially how we deal with them today, is how they interact with humor and our expectations of humor. That, like we said, they're traveling punchlines where the joke itself, right, is the image, and we're familiar with the image, whether it's a screen grab from SpongeBob or whatever it is, right? We know the image, and the joke is made by the setup or the description, the context that the composer of the meme has put it in. And when it comes to memes as rhetorical, as persuasive, that in and of itself, I think, but I also define rhetoric broadly, is enough to make them persuasive. But we can also look at memes as a product, as something that people do and use to make a living, because people do. There's so many Instagram accounts that people make a living on just sharing memes, either of their own creation or that other people have created. Um, Definitely influencers on TikTok, especially if they're into humor, but also um, on Twitter, another huge place for that. But all this basically changes the context of the meme into a product, into a rhetorical product. And when that happens, we can see and notice the persuasion a little bit more obviously, because again, we're trying to be directly persuaded. And so under that idea, under that model, I think it functions, like the slide says, kind of like a laugh track, means to an end. Because remember, um, weird, this video you can watch it on your own. I'll post it in this, it'll be on the slides. But shows have laugh tracks, and they have since, goodness, the 50s. But a lot of people don't like laugh tracks, but they feel they have to have them. And memes sort of fill a very similar role. I think it's a useful metaphor for us to explore how the persuasion functions there. One is that they are clearly fake, which is to say, we know that memes are created, we know that they're generated, right? Someone has sat down and thought this would be funny, or this is a good thing to share. And so, in that sense, it's clearly produced, it's clearly fabricated. And a lot of people hate them, right? Especially different kinds, different types. Also, people tend to have poor ideas of what a meme is. But it's often maligned, right? You'll hear, especially in, goodness, like news media, talking about memes as if they're trash. And that's the same way that producers and directors often talk about laugh tracks, but again, feel like it's something that they have to include, especially when sitcoms are filmed in front of a live studio audience. So they're kind of maligned, kind of uh, looked down upon, but also seen as a necessity, especially when you think about brands and how they interact with their customers online. They try really hard to do memes. They try so hard, and most often they fail. You have some online presence that is good, that manages to sort of identify with its audience, like Wendy's, but a lot is bad. Pizza Rolls was really bad for a long time. And money, right? You do it for money. The reason that brands and also people making their living on content produce these things is for money. They're very clearly a product. And as such, there has to be a connection with an audience. How do you connect with an audience? Through identification. And identification is a hugely important rhetorical process, to the point where Kenneth Burke describes it as essential. So let's talk a little bit about identification. As I mentioned, Kenneth Burke says that it is basic, that it's fundamental to persuasion. Um, and I tend to disagree. This book, The Rhetoric of Motives, comes out in 1950. And he says that identification is the necessary substrate for persuasion. By substrate, he means the thing from which persuasion arises is identification. So a speaker has to have some sort of identification with an audience in order to be able to persuade them. Some sort of commonality or some sort of way of saying that their relationship to something is similar to my relationship to something. We can use that as a way to open up an interaction. And it's important. And because it's that basic level, Burke argues that it's quote unquote stronger than persuasion. It's more required than persuasion. And think of hunger versus eating as a way to understand this. You can eat without being hungry, right? It's fun. You can snack. There's all sorts of things you can do. But hunger at its core, right, is a thing that's going to inspire eating. It's a thing designed such that we will eat. Identification functions the way that hunger does, and eating would be persuasion. So it's sort of like the primordial part. You can try to persuade someone without identifying with them. It's probably not going to work, though. If you identify yourself with them, if there's some sort of connection, then you're much more likely to actually persuade them. Therefore, identification happens before persuasion. Here's an image sort of where persuasion takes place. You have the speaker and the audience and the places where they overlap, the things that they have in common, the places where they identify is where persuasion happens. It's where you're able to connect with your audience. And so this brings us to ethos. When we're talking about connections to an audience, we need to talk about credibility and character. And so thinking about identification, isn't it just ethos, right? Isn't it just credibility that you're building with your audience? It's commonly seen as fitness of the speaker for message is ethos, but a better translation, not transaction, that's not good. Translation is character, right? A way to define it. So isn't identification just ethos? Both require audience analysis in order for a speaker to make a connection with an audience. Both require credibility or are trying to build credibility. I want to connect to my audience so they see me as credible for what I'm talking about and so that I can persuade them. Ethos is all about credibility. And constitutive rhetoric that we have going on there, right? Where I identify with you and through this speech, through this text, I can create an in-group, right? I can basically impose that identification into a material relationship through the text of my speech. But no, it's not the same, right? Identification is not just ethos. So let's talk about the identity in identification and why it's not just ethos. First, it's a process. Ethos can happen in a moment, right? Your position can give you ethos. It's hard for a position or a career to give you identification. But this process of identification happens the same way that a lot of processes actually have, like learning and an analogy. And the reason I say that is because all of these processes are based on recognizing the relationship between things and making comparisons. So an analogy is a comparison. This is to that as that is to some other thing, right? And learning, we do the same thing. We compare things and then we can add them to our knowledge. Like, oh, okay, Plato is to Socrates as a writer is to a character, as far as we know, right? Presuming, of course, that, people actually existed. But learning, analogy, and identification function as very similar processes. It's about recognizing similarities and building upon them. And rhetoric, as a tool, is uniquely suited to explore this process, to explore the relationship between relationships as they occur in meaning as they occur in audience and speaker, as they occur to speaker and artifact and audience. Those relationships are very important. This should sound familiar, right? This should sound kind of like hegemonic struggle, and that's because it is. And rhetoric is suited and has the ability to describe and get in between the cracks to see specifically what signs, symbols create that connection and see how identification works. So rhetoric is a powerful tool and a powerful discipline. Let's go back to memes for a second. Are they persuasive? Again, sure, absolutely. If you're talking broadly, then yeah, 100%. They attempt to impact our attitude, behavior, or beliefs, if only to try to make us laugh. Technically, that fits. Again, sure, okay. Memes are persuasive, but they are rhetorical. They are extremely rhetorical in how they create meaning, how they function as sort of like a bit of meaning. So they are certainly rhetorical, which means that we can rhetorically analyze memes, be they screenshots, videos, image macros, whatever the case is. Identification as in humor. So memes, because they typically are pointed at recognition, like, oh, I feel that way, I recognize that, I can laugh, that's immediately identification. And also, a laugh or understanding something as funny is sort of a statement of recognition, whether you're recognizing something as surprising or something as silly or something as hitting at some sort of truth. Identification is a huge part of humor, and since memes are so often associated with humor, they are directly associated with identification. We also enjoy that reflection, seeing ourselves reflected in something. It's why for a long time you saw those BuzzFeed lists that were like 27 things people who breathe oxygen will know to be true. It's like, whoa, I breathe oxygen. Let me see if I think those things are true. It's seeing yourself reflected, and that is identification. Identification is recognition. So we talked about that as well. So humor and recognition, and also humor can be recognition. That gets a little bit more complicated in humor theory. So are they persuasive in the sense that they're rhetorical? Absolutely. In this, like on their own face, can you be persuaded by a meme? Technically, yeah, but we can absolutely rhetorically analyze them. I like this meme a lot. This eyeshadow palette is so cute. The joke, of course, being that those are not eyeshadows. That's guacamole and different salad or salsas. I'm gonna say salad. So it's funny, right? And you laugh because you recognize that it's sort of absurd, the idea of putting these things on your eyes. When you break down humor, it gets more technical and less fun, but still very silly. A good meme, I think. So thank you, right? Thank you for listening about memes and namaste. Here's where namaste becomes important. Namaste functions as a recognition of personhood. I identify with the expanse, the goddess, the infinity within you, right? That part of the universe that is with me is also with you. So thank you for listening. Namaste, and hopefully now you're prepared to do some analysis of memes.